It started with the little things. Sophie's habits shifted in ways most might overlook, but after 10 years of marriage, I noticed. She'd laugh at her phone while claiming it was just a meme a friend sent, her thumb hovering over the screen like she didn't want me to see. Her once warm hugs grew distracted, her mind somewhere else even as she held me. But what really caught my attention was how her demeanor lit up whenever she crossed paths with Ethan, our new neighbor. Ethan was the kind of guy people naturally gravitated toward. Charming, outgoing, the life of any conversation. When he moved in 2 houses down, he introduced himself with a kind of confidence that made everyone feel like an old friend. I didn't think much of it at first. But soon, I'd noticed Sophie lingering near him, her smile too wide, her laugh too bright. She started talking about how helpful Ethan was, whether it was lending her a ladder or giving advice about landscaping. It was always something small but delivered with an undertone that made my gut tighten. Still, I kept my cool. Jumping to conclusions wasn't my style. Instead, I started watching. Quietly. Carefully. I'd catch moments, a glance too long, conversations that stopped when I walked in. Then, there was the day I came home early from work. I saw her in the backyard, chatting with Ethan over the fence. Her body language told the whole story. She leaned in, her hand brushing her hair in that subconscious way women do when they want to be noticed. And he noticed. I didn't say anything that night. But as Sophie scrolled through her phone at the dinner table, absent-mindedly pushing her food around her plate, I made my decision. If something was going on, I needed proof. And I wasn't about to rely on hunches. One night, while Sophie showered, she left her phone unlocked on the kitchen counter. My heart raced as I picked it up. A part of me wanted to put it back to pretend I hadn't seen the signs, but the other part of me, the part that had noticed every lingering glance and every forced excuse, pressed forward. The messages were worse than I expected. At first, they were just playful exchanges. But as I scrolled deeper, they turned into something else entirely. I can't wait to see you again, and you make me feel so alive were bad enough. But the pictures, those were a dagger straight to the heart. Sophie, my wife, the woman I'd vowed to love and protect, had crossed every line imaginable. I put the phone back exactly where I found it, my hands trembling. She didn't suspect a thing when she came back to the kitchen, her hair damp and her smile casual. Inside, though, my world was collapsing. A part of me wanted to confront her right there, demand answers, and throw her betrayal back in her face. But I didn't. That would have been too easy for her. She'd cry, deny, maybe even turn it around on me. No, I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of controlling the narrative. If she thought she could fool me, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. I wasn't just going to expose her lies, I was going to make her regret every single one. From the moment I saw those messages, I knew Sophie and Ethan wouldn't get away with this. Still, I needed to act like I hadn't seen a thing. If I tipped my hand too soon, they'd cover their tracks. The next morning, I brewed coffee and made Sophie's favorite breakfast, blueberry pancakes. When she came downstairs, her surprise showed. "Wow, Nathan," she said, smiling. "What's the occasion?" "Just thought you deserved a treat," I replied casually. She kissed my cheek, and I wondered, was that guilt, or just her usual routine? She talked about her day over breakfast, work, errands, dinner with friends. It sounded normal, but now, I noticed the cracks. Her words were too rehearsed, her smiles too polished. Her eyes didn't meet mine as often as they used to. After she left, I thought about my next move. I could have confronted her, but that wouldn't be enough. Not for the betrayal I felt. They needed to understand the consequences of their actions. So, I decided to gather more evidence, starting with Sophie's schedule. She left at 8:15 a.m., ran errands at lunch, and returned by 5:30 p.m. Most days were ordinary, but on Tuesdays and Thursdays, her errands stretched suspiciously long. One Thursday, I stayed home, claiming to feel unwell. At noon, Sophie left, dressed sharper than usual. 15 minutes later, I followed her. Sure enough, her car was parked near Ethan's house. I pulled over a few houses away and watched. She knocked on Ethan's door, and he opened it with a grin. She stepped inside, and the door shut behind them. My stomach churned. Seeing it with my own eyes cut deeper than the texts or photos ever could. I snapped a picture of her car near Ethan's house and drove away, gripping the wheel tightly. At home, I paced, trying to process it. But this wasn't the time to lose control. It was time to act. When Sophie came home that evening, I was calm. She kissed me, asked about my day, and I replied casually, mentioning how quiet it had been. She didn't offer details about her afternoon, and I didn't ask. By the time dinner was over, I'd already started planning. A fake business pitch wasn't something you could throw together overnight, but the gears were turning. Ethan had no idea what was coming. Neither did Sophie. The days that followed were a delicate dance. I needed Sophie to believe I was as oblivious as ever while I worked on the first phase of my plan. I started with Ethan, casually striking up conversations whenever I saw him in the neighborhood. At first, it was nothing big. Small talk about lawn care, local events, or sports. Slowly, I worked to gain his trust. He didn't seem suspicious, and why would he? I was just the friendly neighbor, completely unaware of the affair. Meanwhile, I continued keeping tabs on Sophie. Every interaction with her felt like stepping onto a stage. I'd kiss her goodnight, listen to her stories about work, and laugh at her jokes, all while keeping my true feelings locked away. On the outside, I was the same husband I'd always been. On the inside, I was gathering the final pieces I needed. The next step required careful planning. Ethan had a reputation for being ambitious, always chasing the next big opportunity. That made him the perfect mark for the trap I was setting. One evening, as we chatted in his driveway, I casually brought up a business opportunity. I painted it as a golden ticket, a tech startup with endless potential and minimal risk. His interest was immediate. "Really? A startup?" he asked, his eyes lighting up. "Yeah," I replied smoothly. "I've got some connections through work. They're looking for private investors right now. Small group, huge potential." Ethan's ego took the bait. He was already imagining himself as a savvy investor, someone who could make a fortune with the right moves. I didn't press too hard. I let the idea simmer, knowing he'd bring it up again soon. At home, I started creating the framework for the fake company. It had to look real: websites, documents, logos, and everything in between. Late at night, while Sophie slept, I worked in silence, crafting a pitch that would convince Ethan he'd stumbled onto the investment of a lifetime. As I worked, my anger simmered under the surface, but I kept it in check. Revenge, I reminded myself, wasn't about rage, it was about precision. Every detail mattered, and every step had to be perfect. Over the next week, Ethan asked more questions about the startup. I fed him just enough information to keep him hooked, describing impressive returns and hinting at how quickly things were moving. "It's exclusive," I told him one afternoon. "Once the slots are filled, that's it." That did the trick. By the end of the week, Ethan was eager to invest. Sophie, ever the optimist about Ethan's potential, encouraged him. She didn't know the trap I was laying, but her support only made it easier to nudge Ethan further. At the same time, I began planting seeds of doubt in Ethan's wife, Hannah. Anonymous tips, vague but compelling, hinted at her husband's infidelity. I didn't go too far, just enough to make her uneasy and curious. It was a slow burn, and I knew it would take time to bear fruit. But if everything went according to plan, Hannah would be exactly where I needed her when the moment came. As the weeks went on, I felt a strange sense of calm. For the first time since I discovered the affair, I wasn't overwhelmed by anger or pain. I had a purpose, a goal. Every step brought me closer to the reckoning Sophie and Ethan had coming. They thought they were clever, sneaking around behind my back. But the truth was, I was always one step ahead. And soon, they'd realize just how much they'd underestimated me. Ethan's eagerness to invest grew quickly. Every time we talked, he leaned in closer, asking more questions about the startup. His ambition made him the perfect mark. At a neighborhood barbecue, I casually mentioned how some investors were mortgaging properties to maximize their stakes. Ethan's eyes lit up. "That's serious," he said. "Yeah," I replied, flipping a burger. "But with the returns they're projecting? It's a no-brainer." I could see the wheels turning in his mind. A week later, he called me, saying he was ready. He'd liquidated assets and secured a loan against his house to make a hefty investment. "I want to go big," he said confidently. "Smart move," I told him, hiding my satisfaction. We finalized the paperwork, with Ethan signing contracts that legally transferred one of his most valuable properties to me as collateral. The documents were airtight, and he didn't bother to read the fine print. At home, I kept everything normal. Sophie was oblivious, going about her routine, laughing at my jokes and sharing details of her day. She seemed lighter, almost happier, like the thrill of her affair had given her a second wind. It made me sick, but I held my composure. Meanwhile, I ramped up my anonymous messages to Ethan's wife, Hannah. Each note offered just enough detail to fuel her suspicions. At first, she seemed hesitant, but soon, her doubt turned to anger. She started asking questions, which I knew would confirm what she feared. With Ethan's money secured and Hannah on edge, it was time for the grand reveal. I planned it perfectly, a neighborhood barbecue in my backyard, attended by everyone Sophie and Ethan considered friends. I told Ethan I'd present the startup as a way to share the opportunity with others. He was eager to show off his supposed success and stood front and center as I began. The first few slides looked professional: projections, graphs, and fabricated testimonials. Then, I clicked to the next slide, and the atmosphere shifted. On the screen were Sophie and Ethan's text exchanges, the messages incriminating and explicit. Gasps echoed through the crowd. Then, the final slide, a photo of them in a hotel room, irrefutable proof of their affair. The crowd fell silent, everyone stunned. Sophie's face drained of color, and Ethan froze, his confident grin wiped away. "Ethan," I said, stepping forward, my voice calm but firm, "your investment wasn't in a company. It was in the destruction of my marriage. And now, I'm returning the favor." Before he could respond, Hannah stepped forward, clutching divorce papers. She threw them at Ethan, her voice trembling with rage. "You disgust me," she spat. The guests murmured, exchanging shocked looks as the scene unfolded. The fallout was immediate. Ethan stammered, trying to explain, but his words failed him. Sophie stood frozen, humiliated in front of the neighbors who once admired her. I stood back, watching as their carefully constructed lies unraveled in front of everyone. By the time the barbecue ended, Ethan and Sophie were ruined. Socially, financially, and personally. And for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of calm. Every piece had fallen perfectly into place. The aftermath of the barbecue was everything I'd imagined, and more. Ethan was a wreck. His finances, reputation, and marriage were all in shambles. The investment he'd been so eager about had drained him dry. With the contract he'd signed, I now legally owned one of his most valuable properties, and there was nothing he could do about it. Sophie didn't fare any better. The neighbors couldn't stop talking about the spectacle. Whispers of her betrayal spread quickly, and her pristine image was shattered. Worse, I'd taken extra steps to ensure the fallout extended beyond our social circle. Her workplace had always prized her integrity, so I anonymously forwarded the incriminating evidence to her boss. Within days, she lost her job, her professional reputation in ruins. At home, Sophie was a shadow of her former self. She avoided me, retreating into the guest room, but I wasn't interested in her apologies or explanations. The trust was gone, and so was any affection I'd once felt for her. I spent my time focusing on practical matters, consulting with lawyers, sorting out financials, and making arrangements for my future without her. Meanwhile, Ethan's wife, Hannah, wasted no time moving forward. The divorce papers were just the beginning. She exposed his actions to their mutual friends and family, leaving him isolated and humiliated. He tried to contact me once, probably to beg for leniency, but I didn't answer. What could he possibly say that would change anything? One evening, Sophie finally broke her silence. She approached me in the kitchen, her face pale and drawn. "Nathan," she began, her voice trembling, "can we talk?" I leaned back against the counter, arms crossed. "Talk about what, Sophie? The affair? The lies? Or maybe how you thought you'd never get caught?" She flinched, but I didn't let up. "You didn't just betray me. You betrayed the life we built together. And for what? A fling with a man who can't even keep his own house." Tears welled in her eyes, but they didn't move me. "I made a mistake," she said weakly. "I was stupid. But we can fix this, if you'll just give me a chance." I shook my head. "There's nothing to fix, Sophie. You burned it all down. She looked like she might argue but instead retreated to the guest room without another word. I stayed in the kitchen, staring at the empty space where we used to share meals, trying to feel something. Anything, but all I felt was relief. The weight of her lies was gone, and with it, the illusion of the life we'd been living. The next morning, I called my lawyer to finalize the divorce proceedings. I didn't see the point in dragging things out. Sophie tried to bargain, offering to give up her share of the house if I'd reconsider, but I refused. Letting her stay in my life, even in a diminished role, was out of the question. As the days turned into weeks, the dust began to settle. The neighborhood found a new topic of gossip, and my house grew quieter. I spent my evenings on the porch, sipping a drink and thinking about the future. For the first time in months, I felt a strange sense of peace. Sophie and Ethan thought they could outsmart me, that their betrayal would go unnoticed. But in the end, they played themselves. And while their lives lay in ruins, I was finally free. Sophie moved out a week after I filed the divorce papers. She packed her things quietly, avoiding eye contact, as if the weight of her actions had finally sunk in. I didn't help or offer words of comfort. What could I say? She'd destroyed everything we had, and now she was facing the consequences. The house felt different without her. Emptier, quieter. At first, I thought I'd feel lonely, but instead, it was a relief. I wasn't pretending anymore, wasn't holding back my anger or playing the part of the clueless husband. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I could breathe. The fallout for Ethan was far messier. Hannah didn't just divorce him, she dismantled his entire life. She sold their house, moved back in with her parents, and told anyone who'd listen about his betrayal. Ethan's social circle evaporated, and with no financial safety net left after his investment, he was forced to move into a shabby apartment on the edge of town. I heard from mutual acquaintances that he tried reaching out to Sophie after the barbecue, probably hoping she'd take him in. But Sophie had her own problems to deal with. No job, no income, and no one willing to take her side. If they had any contact, it didn't last long. They'd both burned too many bridges to salvage anything, even with each other. Meanwhile, I focused on rebuilding my life. I threw myself into work, spending long hours at the office and taking on new projects. It wasn't just a distraction, it was a way to reclaim a sense of purpose, to remind myself that I could move forward. My colleagues noticed the change, but no one pried. I appreciated that. One night, as I sat on the porch with a drink in hand, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Sophie. "Can we talk? Just once. Please." I stared at the message for a long time, my thumb hovering over the screen. Part of me wanted to hear her out, to see if she'd finally take responsibility for what she'd done. But the stronger part of me, the part that had watched her lie and scheme without remorse, knew it wasn't worth it. I deleted the message and went back to sipping my drink. A few days later, I ran into Hannah at the grocery store. She looked better than I expected. Confident, almost radiant. "Nathan," she said, smiling, "you look free." I chuckled. "That's one way to put it. How about you? How are you holding up?" She shrugged but kept smiling. "Better than I thought I would." Turns out losing Ethan wasn't a loss at all. "How about you? Are you doing okay?" "Better every day," I replied honestly. We talked for a while, swapping stories about our new routines and how we were adjusting. There was an ease between us, an understanding that came from surviving the same betrayal. Before we parted ways, she hesitated, then said, "If you ever want to grab coffee or something, let me know. I think we've earned a little happiness." For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of something. Hope, maybe. "I might just take you up on that," I said. As I drove home, I thought about the life ahead of me. It wouldn't be easy, and the scars of Sophie's betrayal would linger for a while. But I'd already taken the hardest steps, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could see a future that wasn't defined by what I'd lost but by what I could rebuild. Life slowly settled into a new rhythm. Without Sophie in the house, everything felt quieter but less strained. I didn't have to tiptoe around the unspoken tension or force myself to fake smiles anymore. It was just me now, and that simplicity was a strange comfort. Sophie tried reaching out a couple more times, through text and email. Each message was some variation of an apology, though none of them seemed genuine. "I made a mistake," she'd write, or "I wasn't thinking clearly." It was the same refrain, vague regret, but never accountability. I ignored every message. She'd had her chance to explain, and she squandered it. One evening, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone. There we were at a beach, smiling like we didn't have a care in the world. There was Sophie on our anniversary trip, laughing at some joke I'd made. And there was Ethan too, standing next to me at a barbecue, a beer in his hand and a grin on his face. It was surreal looking back, knowing what I knew now. How long had I been blind? How long had they been laughing behind my back? I shook off the thoughts and set my phone down. Dwelling on the past wouldn't help. Instead, I turned my attention to the future. Hannah's suggestion to grab coffee had lingered in my mind since we'd bumped into each other. There was something about her, a quiet strength, a resilience, that I couldn't ignore. She'd been hurt just as badly as I had, yet she seemed to be moving forward with her head held high. The next day, I texted her, about that coffee. You free this week? Her reply came almost immediately. How's Thursday afternoon? My treat. That small exchange lifted a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. For the first time in months, I was looking forward to something. When Thursday rolled around, I met Hannah at a small cafe on the edge of town. She was already there when I arrived, sipping a latte and waving me over with a warm smile. Glad you came, she said as I sat down. Me too, I admitted. We talked for hours, far longer than I'd expected. At first, it was about the obvious, Ethan and Sophie, the chaos they'd left in their wake, and how we were piecing our lives back together. But as the conversation went on, we drifted to lighter topics. She told me about her plans to start fresh in a new city, and I shared my recent obsession with hiking trails around the area. By the time we left, it felt like I'd known her forever. She gave me a quick hug before heading to her car, and I found myself smiling as I watched her leave. That night, I sat on the porch, nursing a drink and thinking about the day. For so long, I'd felt like my life was defined by Sophie's betrayal, like it was a weight I'd never shake. But sitting there, I realized something had shifted. The anger was still there, yes, but it no longer consumed me. I wasn't just the guy who got cheated on. I was Nathan again, someone with a future worth looking forward to. And maybe, just maybe, that future included someone like Hannah. The coffee with Hannah was a turning point. 4 months, I'd been drowning in anger and betrayal, but that simple meeting reminded me there was still a life to rebuild. I didn't expect anything romantic. She had her own plans, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for more. But it gave me hope, a small spark I hadn't felt in ages. In the weeks that followed, I focused on creating new routines. I started running again, something I hadn't done since college. At first, it was grueling. I could barely make it a mile without feeling like my lungs were on fire. But by the second week, I was running 3 miles, and the sense of accomplishment felt like reclaiming a part of myself. Work became another outlet. I took on extra projects, throwing myself into tasks that kept my mind occupied. My boss even joked one day, "You're like a man on a mission." I just smiled. The truth was, staying busy left less room for the ghosts of Sophie and Ethan to creep in. Sophie, meanwhile, had gone silent. The emails and texts stopped, and I hadn't heard from her in weeks. Occasionally, I overheard neighbors gossiping about her struggles, losing her job, living with a distant relative, but I didn't dwell on it. I wasn't interested in her downfall anymore. I was too focused on moving forward. One evening, as I settled on the couch with a beer, my phone buzzed. It was Hannah. "How's your hiking obsession coming along? Found any good trails?" I smiled and texted back, "A few. Want to join me?" Her reply came quickly. "Absolutely. How about Saturday?" We met at a trail just outside of town. The air was cool and fresh, the kind of weather that made you feel alive. Hannah showed up in hiking boots and a flannel, her hair pulled into a ponytail. "You weren't kidding about the views," she said as we started up the trail. The walk was easy and comfortable, our conversation flowing as naturally as it had at the cafe. She shared her plans to move closer to her parents and give her kids a fresh start. I told her about the routines I'd been building, running, work, trying to find myself again. It struck me how much we had in common. 2 people picking up the pieces after someone else's choices had shattered their lives. The hike lasted a few hours. By the time we reached the summit, The sun was starting to set, painting the valley below in warm orange and gold. "It feels good to be up here," she said quietly. "Like the rest of the world doesn't matter for a little while." I nodded. "It's peaceful." On the way back down, I felt lighter. Maybe it was the fresh air or the way Hannah smiled when she talked about her kids, but something about that day made me believe things could get better. Not just for me, but for both of us. When we reached the parking lot, she hesitated before getting into her car. "Thanks for today, Nathan. I needed this." "Me too," I replied. She smiled and leaned in to kiss my cheek. "See you soon?" "Definitely," I said, already thinking about our next hike. That night, as I sat on the porch with my usual drink, I found myself smiling again. For so long, my focus had been on the pain and making Sophie and Ethan pay. But now, for the first time, I was thinking about the future, something that had nothing to do with them. And that, more than anything, felt like the true victory. After that hike with Hannah, our conversations became more frequent. It started with casual texts, sharing pictures of trails or chatting about weekend plans. But over time, the messages became more personal. We talked about the moments we'd struggled to get through, the days when the weight of betrayal had felt unbearable. For the first time in months, I felt like someone truly understood what I'd been through. Hannah had her own scars. Ethan's affair with Sophie wasn't just a betrayal, it was a public spectacle. Friends she'd thought she could count on had distanced themselves, unsure of where their loyalties lay. "It's funny," she said during one of our calls. "People always say they hate drama, but they sure love watching it unfold." She was trying to stay strong for her kids, but it wasn't easy. "Every time I look at them, I wonder if I failed them," she admitted one evening. "Like I should have seen it coming and done something to protect them from all this." "You didn't fail them," I told her firmly. "If anything, you're showing them what strength looks like. How to keep going even when everything falls apart." She was quiet for a moment, then said, "Thanks, Nathan. I needed to hear that." Our friendship deepened, but we kept things simple. I wasn't looking for a relationship, and neither was she, not yet. Still, the connection between us was undeniable. It wasn't about filling a void or rushing into something new. It was about healing, about finding moments of peace in each other's company. One afternoon, Hannah invited me over to help with a small home project. She'd recently moved into a rental closer to her parents, and the place needed some work. "Nothing fancy," she said, laughing. "Just a fresh coat of paint in the living room." When I arrived, her kids were running around the house, full of energy. Hannah introduced me to them, and I was struck by how much they resembled her. Bright eyes, quick smiles, and a determination that seemed far beyond their years. As we painted, the conversation was easy and light. The kids helped for a while, though more paint ended up on their faces than the walls. Hannah laughed as she wiped their cheeks, her joy infectious. For a moment, I forgot about everything. Sophie, Ethan, the months of pain, and just enjoyed the simple act of being present. When the walls were finished, and the kids had gone off to play, Hannah brought out 2 mugs of coffee. We sat on the couch, admiring our work. "Not bad," I said, gesturing to the freshly painted walls. "Not bad at all," she replied, smiling. There was a warmth in the room, a sense of calm I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't about romance or rushing into something new. It was about connection. For the first time, I started to think that maybe, just maybe, I could let someone in again. As I drove home that evening, I thought about how much had changed in the past few months. I'd gone from being consumed by anger and betrayal to finding moments of peace and even happiness. It wasn't a straight path. There were still hard days, moments when the past crept back in, but it was progress. And for the first time, I felt like I was heading somewhere worth going. The weeks that followed felt like a quiet kind of transformation. I spent more time with Hannah and her kids, helping out with small projects around her house or joining them for dinner. It wasn't planned or rushed. It just happened naturally. Every moment spent with them felt light, like I was rediscovering a part of myself I thought I'd lost. Hannah's kids were full of energy, always pulling me into their world. Her son, Jamie, loved to show off his latest Lego creations, while her daughter, Mia, had a knack for convincing me to join tea parties. At first, I felt out of my element, but their enthusiasm was contagious. Before long, I found myself building castles out of blocks and sipping imaginary tea from tiny cups. Hannah would watch, smiling from the doorway. "You're a natural," she teased one evening as I carefully balanced a plastic tiara on my head for Mia. Don't get used to it, I joked, though I couldn't help but smile. As the days passed, I noticed a shift in myself. The bitterness I'd carried for so long started to fade. It wasn't gone entirely. There were still moments when I'd catch myself replaying the past, thinking about Sophie and Ethan. But those moments were becoming less frequent, their hold on me weaker. One Saturday, Hannah invited me to join her family for a picnic at a nearby park. The weather was perfect, warm sun, a light breeze, and just enough clouds to keep the heat at bay. We spread out a blanket under a large oak tree, unpacking sandwiches, fruit, and snacks. The kids ran off to explore, their laughter echoing through the park. As Hannah and I sat on the blanket, watching them, she turned to me. "You seem different lately," she said. "Different how?" I asked. "Lighter," she replied. "Like you're not carrying the weight of the world anymore." I thought about her words, then nodded. "I think I'm finally starting to let it go. The anger, the resentment. It's still there, but it doesn't control me like it used to." She smiled, her gaze soft. "That's good. You deserve that." "Maybe," I said, looking out at the park. "I guess I just realized there's more to life than what I've lost." Hannah reached over, her hand brushing mine. "There is," she said simply. We sat there for a moment, the silence between us comfortable. It wasn't about filling the void left by our pasts, it was about building something new, something real. By the time the sun began to set, Jamie and Mia were exhausted from running around, their energy finally spent. As we packed up the picnic, Jamie tugged at my sleeve. "You're coming over for dinner tomorrow, right?" he asked, his wide eyes hopeful. I glanced at Hannah, who shrugged with a smile. "Sure," I said, ruffling his hair. "But only if you save me the biggest slice of dessert." "Deal," Jamie said, grinning. That night, as I drove home, I couldn't help but feel grateful. Life had thrown me into a storm I hadn't seen coming, but somehow, I was finding my way out. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was mine. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like it was enough. Sunday dinner at Hannah's was a lively mix of chaos and warmth. Her kids ran around, giggling as they set the table with mismatched plates and argued over where the fork should go. The air smelled of roasted chicken and fresh rolls, blending with the sound of laughter. It was so different from the silence that had settled over my own house. Messy, imperfect, but alive. Hannah moved seamlessly through it all, gently guiding Jamie to fix the forks and catching Mia mid-swipe as she tried to sneak a carrot off the platter. "Mia," she said with mock sternness, "what did I say about stealing food?" Mia grinned, unapologetic, and dashed away with the carrot. Watching them, I felt something I hadn't in a long time, a sense of belonging. It wasn't just the warmth of the meal or the laughter of the kids. It was the feeling of being part of something real. Dinner was full of stories from the kids. Jamie explained his latest Lego masterpiece, while Mia bragged about how she'd won at hide-and-seek. "He never found me," she said, pointing triumphantly at me. Jamie groaned. "She hid behind a tree. It doesn't count." Hannah caught my eye and smiled. "Looks like she's got you beat." After dinner, the kids dragged me into a board game. Rules were bent, pieces flew, and by the end, Mia declared herself the winner. Jamie, of course, argued that she'd cheated. Hannah laughed from the couch, sipping tea, her laughter light and genuine. For a moment, it felt like everything was exactly as it should be. But amidst the lightness, I couldn't ignore the moments when Hannah's smile faded. A text notification lit up her phone, and though she quickly turned it face down, her shoulders stiffened. It was subtle but unmistakable, an edge to her otherwise easy demeanor. I didn't press, but the thought lingered. Later, as we cleaned up, Hannah handed me a dish towel. "Thanks for coming tonight," she said softly. "I think the kids needed this." "I think I needed this." "I did too," I replied. "I don't think I've laughed this much in years." Her smile was warm, but her eyes held something deeper, something unsaid. "The kids. They really like you. They haven't been this comfortable around anyone in a long time." "They're amazing," I said honestly. "You've done such a great job with them." Her smile widened, but there was a flicker of hesitation. She glanced toward the counter where her phone sat, screen dark. It's been a hard year. For all of us." Her voice faltered, the unspoken weight behind her words hanging in the air. I opened my mouth to ask, but before I could, Jamie appeared in the doorway, holding his Lego spaceship. "Nathan, come look." I added wings. The moment passed, and I followed Jamie, but Hannah's words stuck with me. When I left that night, the warmth of the evening was mixed with quiet curiosity. As I said goodbye, Hannah brushed her hand against mine. "You're welcome any time," she said softly. Her words were genuine, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more she wasn't saying. The evening had been wonderful, comforting and light, but beneath it, I sensed something unspoken, something guarded in her smiles and quick glances at her phone. It felt like a puzzle, and though I didn't have the full picture, I knew it was one I wanted to figure out. Hannah's quiet hesitations had been on my mind all week. Something was bothering her, though she hadn't shared what. I wanted to ask but knew it had to be on her terms. On Saturday, she texted me, "The kids keep asking when you're coming back. You're becoming quite the favorite." I smiled. "Tell them I'll swing by tomorrow. I owe Jamie a rematch on that board game anyway." The next day, I arrived to the sound of Jamie and Mia arguing over which game we should play. Hannah greeted me at the door, smiling warmly, though her eyes still carried that weight I couldn't ignore. "Welcome to the chaos," she said with a laugh as Mia grabbed my hand. "You're playing Candyland with me." The afternoon flew by in laughter and playful banter. By the time the kids went to bed, I was drained but content. After tucking them in, Hannah and I settled on the couch with cups of tea. The house was silent, the kind of quiet that begged unspoken thoughts to surface. "Hannah," I said softly, "are you okay? I mean, really?" Her fingers froze around her cup, and she glanced at me, startled. For a moment, I thought she might dodge the question, but she sighed instead. "I've been trying to keep things normal for the kids," she said quietly. "But Ethan isn't making it easy." My jaw tightened at the mention of his name, but I stayed calm. "What's he done?" She hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her cup. "He's been texting, apologies, excuses, promises that he's changed. At first, I ignored him, but now he's showing up. The grocery store, the park, places where he knows I'll be." Her vulnerability hit me like a punch to the gut. "Has he threatened you?" "No," she said, shaking her head. "But it's unsettling. I don't want him confusing the kids, and I don't need the reminder." Her words hung heavy in the air. Seeing her, always so strong, now weighed down by Ethan's interference sparked something protective in me. "Have you thought about a restraining order?" I asked. She nodded but didn't look convinced. "I've thought about it, but I don't want to escalate things unless I have to. I just want peace." "You deserve peace," I said firmly. "And if you need anything, you can count on me." Her eyes softened, and she reached across the space between us to place her hand on mine. "Thank you, Nathan. I don't know what I'd do without you." The moment lingered, unspoken understanding passing between us. It wasn't just about Ethan anymore, or even Sophie. It was about us. Two people finding strength in each other after everything we'd been through. Driving home that night, my thoughts churned. The idea of Ethan lurking around Hannah's life made my blood boil. He'd taken enough from her already, and now he was trying to maintain his grip on her future. Hannah wanted peace, and I'd respect that. But if Ethan didn't back off, I wasn't sure how long I could keep standing by quietly. The days passed, but my thoughts kept circling back to Hannah and Ethan. The idea of him intruding on her life, and now her children's, made it hard to focus. I didn't want to push her, but I hoped she'd take steps to protect herself. One evening, Hannah reached out, her message short but weighted. "Can we talk?" When I called, her voice trembled as she explained what had happened. Ethan had shown up at Mia's school, stopped by staff before getting too far. Although Mia hadn't been aware, the call from the principal had left Hannah shaken. The thought of Ethan trying to see her daughter without permission was a line too far. The school assured her they would take precautions, but it clearly wasn't enough. She hesitated to escalate things, but I could sense her frustration. Ethan's persistence wasn't just a nuisance anymore, it was a threat to her peace of mind. The next morning, I met her at the courthouse. She looked composed but weary, her determination visible in the set of her shoulders. Filing the paperwork for a restraining order was a long process, but she tackled it with quiet resolve. I stayed by her side as she navigated the system, offering support without needing to say much. Once it was over, she let out a deep breath, as though she'd been holding it for weeks. It wasn't a full resolution, but it was the first step toward reclaiming her safety. Later, over coffee at a quiet cafe, her thoughts seemed heavy. She admitted how much she hated that it had come to this. Formal measures to enforce boundaries Ethan should have respected on his own. Yet she understood it was necessary for her and her kids. Before I dropped her off, she hesitated, as though weighing her next move. She thanked me, not just for coming with her, but for being there in ways I hadn't even realized. Her gesture of gratitude, a soft kiss on the cheek, was quick and subtle, yet it stayed with me long after I left. Driving home, I felt a mix of emotions. Anger at Ethan for pushing her to this point. Admiration for her strength in protecting her family. And something deeper, an undeniable sense that this wasn't just about rebuilding. It was the beginning of something entirely new. The days after the courthouse visit felt lighter. The restraining order gave Hannah a sense of control she hadn't had in weeks. Though Ethan's presence still lingered in her mind, she seemed more at ease, less tense. I found myself spending more time with her and the kids, helping with small projects, staying for dinner, or just being around. It wasn't forced, it felt natural, like pieces quietly falling into place. The kids were thriving, their laughter filling the house. Hannah, too, seemed more relaxed, though flashes of worry still crossed her face, especially when her phone buzzed unexpectedly. I could tell she was carrying more than she let on. One evening, I noticed her standing by the window, staring out at the street. When I knocked, she turned quickly, forcing a smile as she opened the door. We slipped into the usual routine, playing games with the kids and sharing stories over dinner, but something felt off. While we cleaned up after dinner, she finally mentioned seeing a car near the school earlier in the week. It resembled Ethan's. He hadn't done anything, but it was enough to unsettle her, making her wonder if he was testing the restraining order. Her calm demeanor faltered briefly as she gripped the counter, her knuckles white. I didn't push, though the thought of Ethan testing boundaries made my blood simmer. I reminded her she wasn't alone. She nodded but didn't say much more. Later, after the kids were in bed, we sat on the couch. Hannah seemed lost in thought, her shoulders tense. As the silence stretched, she finally spoke, her voice barely audible. It's exhausting, pretending everything's fine when it's not. Her words hung between us, heavy with unspoken fears. I didn't respond right away. I just stayed, letting her know without words that I was there. When I left, the look in her eyes lingered with me, gratitude mixed with vulnerability. Driving home, I couldn't shake the thought of Ethan. He hadn't crossed the line yet, but the signs were there. I didn't know what his next move would be, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let him force Hannah back into fear. The tension around Ethan's silence reached a breaking point just a few days later. I was at home, going over work emails, when my phone buzzed with a call from Hannah. Her voice was tight, words tumbling out in a rush. "Nathan, he's here. Ethan's outside." My heart jolted. "Stay inside and lock the doors. I'm coming." I didn't waste a second, grabbing my keys and heading for her house. My thoughts raced. Ethan had ignored the restraining order, showing just how far he was willing to go. Whatever his plan was, it wouldn't end well for him tonight. When I arrived, Hannah's carport light illuminated Ethan's figure in her driveway. He was pacing, his posture agitated. Hannah was inside, watching through the window with her phone clutched in her hand. I stepped out of my car, and his eyes snapped to me. "You shouldn't be here," I said evenly, keeping my distance but holding his gaze. He sneered, his voice slurring slightly. "What, you think you can replace me? This isn't your family. It's mine." His words only cemented what I already knew. Ethan wasn't here for Hannah or the kids. He was here to reclaim control. I stepped closer, my voice steady. "They're not yours anymore. You lost them when you chose yourself over your family." Ethan's anger flared, and he took a step forward, but I didn't back down. Hannah's voice broke the moment, shouting from the porch. "The police are on their way, Ethan. Leave now." Her words stopped him, but only briefly. He looked between us, his face twisting with indecision, before muttering something under his breath and stumbling back toward his car. I stayed rooted in place until his taillights disappeared into the night. Hannah came out then, her face pale but her expression fierce. "Thank you," she said quietly, though her voice trembled. I nodded, but the anger still simmered under my skin. He won't stop unless there are consequences. Pressing charges might be the only way to keep him away. She hesitated, the weight of her decision visible, but finally nodded. "You're right. I'll do it." The police arrived shortly after, taking her statement and promising to escalate the matter. As they left, I stayed by Hannah's side, letting her know she wasn't alone. By the time the house was quiet again, the fear in her eyes had faded, replaced by something else, relief. Sitting together on her couch, I could feel the shift. The worst was over, and with Ethan out of the picture, there was space for something new. She turned to me, her voice soft. "I couldn't have done this without you. You don't have to face anything alone anymore," I said. Her hand found mine, and for the first time, it felt like a beginning, not just an ending. We weren't two broken people anymore. We were building something whole. Driving home that night, I felt an unfamiliar sense of peace. The betrayal that had shattered my life months ago no longer defined me. The weight of anger and revenge had lifted, leaving room for hope. Ethan and Sophie had tried to tear everything apart, but in the ruins, I'd found something stronger. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready to see where it would take me.